Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Having campaigned on a promise to fix everything, 5 weeks into the Trump administration, and things are looking like they're breaking. From eggs to housing prices, prices continue to rise. Jobless claims are up, and rather ironically today, Donald Trump hosted the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, at the White House for the first time. A guy who came into power after a decade and a half of conservative rule and knows a thing or two about inheriting a bad economy. Keir Starmer is now the man trying to claw his country out of a deep economic hole. A hole dug in 2016 when the country narrowly voted in favor of Brexit.
The historic decision by British voters for their country to exit the European Union sent economic shockwaves from the UK to the US and a tidal wave of economic worries swamping the markets. The Dow lost over 3% of its value, wiping out all its gains for the year. The EU, established to bring unity and greater economic clout to Europe, is in crisis as Europe, the US, and the rest of the world absorb the profound ramifications.
Now, that right-wing plan to abandon the EU and the euro was sold as a way for Brits to take control over their own economy, even as experts warned it would drive up prices, as well as tanking the British pound, along with trade, salaries, and employment. The experts were right. Brexit was a disaster for the UK, setting back one of the world's strongest economies by years. Even many advocates of Brexit admitted it failed. It has been so bad that a poll last month showed that 55% of British people said their country was wrong to leave the EU. Only 30% had no regrets. It was a completely self-inflicted shock to the entire country and its populace. They are still recovering from almost a decade later. Back in 2016, of course, Donald Trump frequently campaigned on being the guy to bring Brexit to the U.S.
Well, they call me Mr. Brexit over there, so we'll see what happens. The UK wanted independence, and they got it. And you know what? I think they're going to be better off for it, and it's turning out. Now, it's a very short period of time, but it's turning out to be better so far.
No, the opposite, in fact. Now, Mr. Brexit is at it again. There's a growing fear that Trump's election is basically our own version of that catastrophe for the UK in 2016. Trump is pursuing a similarly radical economic agenda, one that economists and other experts warn will lead the U.S. to ruin. Today, we got a lot of signs the American economy is somewhat suddenly trending in the wrong direction, and that Trump could soon make it much, much worse. Trump announcing his long-promised tariffs on Canada and Mexico will go into effect next Tuesday. We'll see if that happens, along with additional new tariffs on China, another 10%. Now, if that happens, and again, been sort of futzing around with this, but all of it will jack up the prices Americans pay for goods imported from those countries. Mexico, our biggest trading partner. Those tariffs, essentially new double-digit sales taxes that you will pay, will drive inflation higher. There will be tariffs in exchange to those other countries for our imports, force a lot of people to cut back their spending. That's worrying the country's top economists. Today, the chairman of the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank, Jeffrey Schmid, warned the Fed might have to keep interest rates high to fight price inflation, even as economic growth slows and possibly stops. A dreaded scenario known as stagflation, something the U.S. hasn't had to worry about since the 1970s. Now, last year, economists were talking about how many times the Fed might cut interest rates. Now they may go higher. That, along with inflated prices, is killing an already tight housing market. Listen to this. This really blew my mind. Today, the National Association of Realtors announced that pending home sales dropped 5% last month to their lowest level since the group started collecting those statistics in 2001. Think about that. Pending home sales today are lower than they were at any point in the Great Recession. No wonder the consumer confidence fell this month. In fact, it was the largest single-month drop in consumer confidence since 2021, back when the post-COVID supply constraints spiked up prices. And it's not just consumers. Business leaders are already starting to sour on Trump as the economic uncertainty starts to pile up. You know what else is piling up? Oh, look at that. Jobless claims. Nearly 250,000 filed for unemployment last week. That's the highest total since last October, as Trump and Elon Musk's firings of government workers start to be felt throughout the economy. We could feel a whole lot more very soon. Again, all this stuff so far is just like around the edges. The U.S. economy is pretty robust. But get this. Yesterday, OMB director and Project 2025 architect Russell Vought sent a memo out to all federal agencies telling them to prepare to initiate large-scale reductions in the workforce, including identifying all employees in their purview who are performing functions that aren't mandated by law and aren't deemed essential during a lapse in appropriations. So that means that every employee who gets sent home during a government funding shutdown, right, when the government is shrunk to sort of its minimum essentials, is potentially on the chopping block. Now, to be clear, that's 800,000 people. 800,000 layoffs we're talking about, possibly. In addition to the hundreds of thousands of firings Musk and his so-called Department of Government Efficiency have already tried to pull off, some of which have been stayed by court, some of which haven't. We get new ones every day. Today we got the National Weather Service. Firings on this scale is just, on its face, a recipe for an enormous recession. It's all gotten so bad that even an economist at the conservative pro-Trump American Enterprise Institute is warning of an economic slowdown. There's more uncertainty that I think is widely appreciated, he told the New York Times today. All the uncertainty around trade policy, uncertainty around some of the things the Department of Government Efficiency is doing, I think will have a chilling effect on investment plans and expansion plans. This is precisely the moment that Great Britain faced with Brexit. It was a moment where a Democratic electorate got together and voted to do something that just made everyone's life worse in, unfortunately, totally foreseeable ways. The result was a lost decade for the UK. Like, basically everyone's lives got worse. The economy got worse. They lost wage growth. They lost prosperity. They lost stability and security. And there was no reason to do it. They just all got together and decided to do it to themselves. There's a growing fear now that Donald Trump is poised to take an American economy that was the envy of the world, strong and stable just a month ago, and drive it into the ground.
During a confirmation hearing yesterday, something happened that I don't think has ever happened before. Multiple nominees for senior Justice Department jobs said during their confirmation hearings out loud that they're not sure that presidents have to obey rulings from the courts. Not always.
There is no hard and fast rule about whether in every instance a public official is bound by a court decision.
Generally, if there's a direct court order that binds a federal or state official, they should follow it.
Why do you say generally? Give me an exception.
I suppose one could imagine hypotheticals in, extreme cases.
The president has now asserted that he has the right basically to do what he thinks is necessary to save the country. And I'm asking whether that includes violating a Supreme Court order.
I've represented President Trump for 2 years. I've never been put in any situation like that, and I don't anticipate being so.
I just got to say, Mr. Chairman, that's a little bit frustrating.
That's a little bit frustrating. You may recognize one of those nominees, the guy with the raspy voice. He's named John Sauer. He is the lawyer who told a federal appeals court that Donald Trump would be within his rights to order a team of Navy SEALs to assassinate his political opponents. That Donald Trump could not be prosecuted for giving such an order. Mr. Sauer is now up for the job of Solicitor General, which is the person who represents the United States government before the Supreme Court. The unnerving refusal by him and other Trump Justice Department nominees yesterday to say that the president must always obey the federal courts, that prompted a stern and somewhat unexpected admonition from one Republican senator, from John Kennedy of Louisiana.
You're all adults. You're all officers of the court. So I'm going to give you some advice. I may be wrong, but I doubt it. Don't ever take the position that you're not going to follow the order of a federal court. Ever. Now, you can disagree with it. Within the bounds of legal ethics, you can criticize it. You can appeal it. Or you can resign.
Joining us now is Illinois Senator Dick Durbin. He is the second highest ranking Democrat in the Senate. He's the ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Durbin, it's a rare pleasure to be able to have you here on the show tonight. Thank you so much for making time.
Thanks, Rachel. Good to be with you.
I know that you have had a strong reaction to those nominees playing with the idea that Donald Trump doesn't have to obey court orders. In an interview today, you called it breathtaking. You said it raises serious existential constitutional questions. We've got to step back and have an honest discussion about this. Why do you feel so strongly about that? What can you explain to our viewers about the seriousness of this issue that you've now come across in these confirmation hearings?
Rachel, you and I have heard many people use the phrase constitutional crisis and try to define exactly when it reaches a breaking point with our Constitution. And it seems to me that the final question is the one I raised with these witnesses. If you were given a court order that says to this president, or any president for that matter, that there are certain actions that they cannot take or should not take or have to take, are you going to follow that order? And it turned out to be a debating topic. I thought the answer was a clear yes, and let's move on. But they wanted to debate it. You heard one of them qualified say, well, generally, yes. And we had these equivocal answers. The most definitive answer came from John Kennedy, as you noted, a Republican of Louisiana, who made it clear what I think the law is. You may hate the order of the court, but you either follow it or resign, period. I can't think of an exception to that. They tried to use an illustration, Korematsu, Dred Scott, those terrible decisions. One of the Republican senators used as an illustration of a court order that you could morally rationalize opposing. But the bottom line is you cannot take a subjective test on this issue. If you did, you'd have someone who might be a racist who says Brown versus Board of Education, integrating our schools. I don't believe in that. That's morally reprehensible to me, and I will not enforce that order in my administration of education. So you see, that's a slippery slope. So I think we've raised a threshold question for the Department of Justice appointments by this administration, and we'd better debate it out because it gets to the heart of our democracy.
It does get to the heart of our democracy. It is the closest thing that we have to an existential question, I think, in terms of our republic. To see the wholesale destruction of the federal government, which I think they're trying to do, to see them appearing to ignore laws when it comes to doing what they're trying to do to the U.S. government is a bad thing, as far as I'm concerned. Disobeying the law seems to be bad. But the prospect that when a court corrects that, when a court declares it to be illegal and orders them to change course, that they will not do it. We are just in a territory that's like where the Roadrunner runs off the end of the cliff and then there's nothing there and it just drops. I have to ask you, because I think you do very clearly see the seriousness of this, what sort of contingency plans elected Democrats have for further sounding the alarm and for trying to correct course and pull that Roadrunner back onto the cliff if they go as far as they're signaling they might?
Well, I can tell you, I think this is going to be a standard inquiry of all those appointed to serve in the administration, particularly in the Department of Justice. As I said, I was a little bit surprised, not totally, because we've seen some rather amazing things done by this administration so far, but I was surprised by the answers yesterday. We cannot take for granted that any of these nominees from the Trump administration will follow the basic tenets of our constitutional law. We have to ask the question. And if the answer comes back no, as did yesterday, or at least qualified as it did yesterday, it is right for us to continue to press the case. As the minority, it's a frustration that we don't have controlling votes on the question. But I am hopeful, and I hope John Kennedy is an illustration, that there will come a moment when Republican senators will come out of hiding and speak up clearly on something as basic as this principle of constitutional law. Because if we abandon this, I'm afraid we've abandoned our democracy.
Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, senior Democrat in the Senate. Sir, thank you for your time tonight. I do really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Rachel.
The facts you are about to see regarding Elon Musk are largely the opposite of his public claims, which are amplified on his billion-dollar media platforms, about cutting government spending or backing transparency or patrolling supposed waste, fraud, abuse, corruption, and conflicts, because here you go. Under the Trump administration, a top agency, you see here, is mulling handing a $2 billion plus contract to Elon Musk's company. And this isn't starting from neutral. The government had already decided on a deal with Verizon. So through the normal process, with the normal expertise and competition, that's where they landed. This Trump administration change that is being considered, that the Washington Post has reported, would cancel that deal and hand it to this Musk company. And that's $2 billion from you, the taxpayer. It would go into Musk's empire. All his emphasis, all the talk, all the hype on cutting other people's government contracts and jobs, that gets attention, and some of it should get attention because there's scrutiny naturally on those kind of big moves. But it also may have people, especially the MAGA crowds and Musk fans out there, believing that his main or big focus is this newfound interest in government efficiency, as if someone who's spent his life building companies, making money, enriching himself is now just taking a total left turn into his governing phase. Well, it only took a few weeks to show how that is not the case. It took a few weeks for Elon Musk to be caught in this kind of self-interested self-dealing. Musk's team lobbying a cabinet member to give him the deal, which really adds layers onto the imagery we saw at this week's cabinet meeting, where Musk positioned himself above all the seated government officials in the cabinet, holding forth. Now, his aides at that agency, because remember, they've infiltrated all these different places, are claiming they determined the job should go to Musk's company, Starlink. In other words, it should go to them. You can even see some of Musk's officials inside the FAA, one engineer there on the right in front of the rocket. The services at stake also matter. So this isn't just a story about whether it is fair or a process story, because this contract involves the nation's air traffic control system. And this contract involves how our air traffic controllers will work and how they'll communicate, and why, without Elon Musk in the room, in a conflict of interest, corruptly lobbying for himself, why the government originally thought a different company was better situated to handle the work. Musk now attacking that company, saying the Verizon system is not working, and so it's putting air travelers at serious risk. Again, you can read those words posted on the platform he owns in the sort of dystopian political capitalist moment we're in, and you can just say, oh, that must be true because somebody said it. Or you could peel back a layer and say, this is something someone is saying to get billions of dollars from you, taxpayer money, that he did not get under the normal bidding and fair process that existed. And I'm not telling you government procurement is a perfect process. I'm just telling you he lost. And now he wants to take it back from Verizon by talking about safety and abusing his government access and apparently lying about transparency and recusal. Now, Musk is blatant. Maybe he thinks he'll get away with it. But this right here is the definition of a conflict of interest. The two men made a vow, you might recall, in their unusual presidential joint interview. And one of the things that came up, because, quote, even Fox had to ask about it, or you could just say Sean Hannity brought up a fair topic, right? However you put it, it came up in that interview. What about the obvious conflict of interest? They made a vow. Musk would recuse from areas of the government that involve him and his companies. The Washington Post report shows he's not doing that. Meanwhile, FAA experts aren't yet making the switch. Musk's team then is pressing those officials. Again, that's a power move. That's not saying, oh, we deserve it or the safety measures would be improved. It's just abusing power and access and corruption, which is precisely why this type of thing is usually more limited. And they are pressing officials who, in this political environment working for Trump, have praised Musk.
Elon Musk's team at SpaceX have come in and given their advice.
I went to Elon Musk and said, I need you to help me build. I want the best minds, and Elon has access to them, and that's why I'm having a conversation with them.
FAA also investigating SpaceX for a rocket that blew up in midair last month. It's one of many agencies that has reviews into Musk's companies, and that's okay, and I'm not prejudging. We don't have evidence to say that every one of those investigations means anything particularly negative about the company. That's how the government works. But now these companies that audit Musk's work for safety and other reasons are now being audited by Musk, a non-cabinet member who is lording his power over the whole cabinet while demanding $2 billion on the side. The chutzpah. Now, Donald Trump, as you probably know, has been very defiant on many issues. But this isn't one where he's just completely claiming there's no potential problem. Donald Trump also has proven to have decent PR and even political instincts. He won that election, right? He seems to understand that if you admit that you're just allowing Musk to take taxpayer money for himself, or that you allow corrupt self-dealing like we see in kleptocracies, like many people often try to say the American model doesn't allow that and we're not as corrupt as some other parts of the world. If you admitted to all that, that would look pretty bad. Maybe too corrupt to admit to. So as I mentioned, I want to show you a couple examples in the joint interview and in other messaging from the White House. This is exactly this kind of self-dealing. Hey, Musk wants $2 billion. It's exactly the kind of self-dealing that Trump has repeatedly claimed wouldn't be allowed, that Musk would have to completely recuse from this. Instead of what we're seeing now, which is he's not recusing, and apparently Trump and other officials are surrendering.
I mean, I haven't asked the president for anything ever.
And if it comes up, how will you handle it?
Well,
he won't be involved.
Yeah, I'll recuse myself if it is.
If there's a conflict, he won't be involved.
Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't want that, and he won't want it.
If Elon Musk comes across a conflict of interest with the contracts and the funding that Doge is overseeing, then Elon will excuse himself from those contracts.
Well, all of our actions are fully public. So if you see anything, you say, like, wait a second, hey, Elon, that seems like maybe that's, you know, there's a conflict there. It's not like people are going to be shy about saying that.
Here we are. You don't have to be shy. This is the conflict. This is your money. This is the people's taxpayer money. Musk wants $2 billion taken away from Verizon and given to him. That's the conflict. And again, you got to be skeptical. You got to be kind of smart. A lot of people, they see that clip on the internet and they say, Elon Musk said he'd recuse. What more do you want? We want him to recuse, like he said he would, but he didn't. Some of the clips I just played you are from the last week. It's not like some old thing a long time ago, maybe somehow. It's roughly overlapping with the period of time that the Washington Post is reporting people working for Musk are doing this. Then you have the cuts. Musk continuing to go after the government programs that do not send him billions. A fresh round of firings that could be the most widespread yet, also courtesy of Post reporting. Social Security officials told to cut staff by half. People at labor who do equal employment opportunity enforcement told they're going to have to go down by potentially 90% reductions, which basically means you're not going to have that enforcement, right? Just this week, judges handed Trump setbacks on the immigration issues and some aspects of the Musk cuts. Today, Trump did get a judge to side with him over firing officials, and the Supreme Court gave Trump more time, effectively a delay that holds the status quo, meaning they're not going to stop some of these cuts in the way they're being pursued for now, but that case likely to take more argument and ultimately perhaps a full Supreme Court briefing. Meanwhile, fired USAID workers were seen leaving the building today because this is what some of the actual people and the actual jobs eliminated looks like. Supporters gathered, there was applause and encouragement. It was, at times, an emotional scene. I'll go on.
Appreciate you. We appreciate all the work that you did. Thank you.
This is the real world. These are real people with real jobs around the country. Over 900,000 affected in red states alone from federal workers. We showed some of the pushback and the concern about that around the country. But you can't look at this in isolation. As far back as the founding of this country, there has always been a narrative, a discussion about limiting government. It's not new to Trump or Musk. It is in the very fabric of the founding documents, limiting government power out of concerns for abuse and out of sometimes concern that the government shouldn't be too big and sprawling and distant from the lived daily lives of the people. And so Elon Musk, if nothing else, is a skilled communicator and student. He has learned some of the rhetoric and the practices of this country. He's learned how people talk about politics. He's bought a whole platform where he can artificially make it sound like he's more popular than he is, or boost a tweet like that, where it's not just a tweet, it's an effort to get $2 billion, as I mentioned, out of you. But you can't look at that only in isolation. You have to look at the broader effort here to take control of this government and then give money, which, again, I cannot emphasize this enough. You will hear me repeat it because it's true and important. Your money back to some of the richest people on earth in a process that they couldn't win the first time. He didn't win the FAA contract. Different company won it. So rather than just accepting the loss, which might be familiar if you think about a habit that Trump and Musk share, Elon Musk says, let me just go back in and cheat this time and use my power to demand that which I otherwise couldn't win in the free market. So it's not only apparently unfair, apparently corrupt, apparently a conflict of interest that he's not recusing, breaking his own vow. It's also a sign of exactly why you need people who are honest about how they want to be skeptical of government and not merely hijacking it to separate you from your money.
Donald Trump, and take it with a grain of salt, has promised full transparency when it comes to most of the big conspiracy theories of the past 60 years, something he campaigned on in the lead up to the election. The issue led to an absolutely Hall of Fame interview clip.
Would you declassify the 9/11 files?
Yeah.
Would you declassify JFK files?
Yeah.
Would you,
I did a lot of it.
Would you declassify the Epstein files?
Yeah, I would.
All right.
I guess I would. I think that less so because, you don't know it. You don't want to affect people's lives if it's phony stuff in there because there's a lot of phony stuff with that whole world. Yeah, I don't know about Epstein so much as I do the others.
Yep, Epstein. Sure about that? Maybe not Epstein. I wonder why Donald Trump wouldn't want the Epstein files being made public. I mean, here he is in 1992 dancing and leering at women with his buddy Jeffrey Epstein at Mar-a-Lago. In 2002, Donald Trump said Jeffrey Epstein is, and I quote him here, a terrific guy. It is even said he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. I wonder why Donald Trump wouldn't want the Epstein files being made public. Thing is, many members of Trump's base do. The Republican House Oversight Committee sent multiple letters to Attorney General Pam Bondi demanding the Epstein files be released. Bondi then went on an apology tour to Fox News, promising the documents would be released imminently. Today, the White House made a big show of handing a bunch of conservative influencers binders labeled the Epstein Files, Phase 1. But the whole stunt was a bust.
What's interesting is we're all waiting for bombshells, we're all waiting for juicy stuff, and that's not what's in this binder. That's not what's in this binder at all.
It is the biggest disappointment, I think, that you'll find. I encourage you to do your own homework on this. It's mostly procedural jargon, Glenn, heavily redacted.
Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, the Florida Republican leading this charge, said of the binders, all caps, "This is not what we or the American people asked for, and a complete disappointment." And the Republican-controlled House Judiciary Committee made a post claiming to link to the Epstein files that actually directed folks to the music video for Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. Sarah Fitzpatrick is a senior investigative producer for NBC News who's been covering this story, and she joins me now. Sarah, first, I mean, what are the files? My understanding is there's a lot that's already public, and this was basically stuff already in the public domain. Do I have that right?
Yes, absolutely, Chris. Essentially, almost all of this, we believe, was already in the public domain. In fact, if you look at the exhibits that they linked to in their press release, it says that these were trial exhibits at Epstein's alleged co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. So most of this information was shown to a jury in some form. And our colleagues sat in the courtroom, as did many members of the American public, and have already seen this information. Some of it is heavily redacted. For example, there's something that they identify as a contact list, which has been known as the black book of contacts that Epstein had. But, this is just this is information that not only was already out there, but doesn't shed any new light on anything that moves this story forward. And honestly, I think my colleagues who are at the Justice Department today kind of described it as a very surreal, kind of haphazard release, almost like a theatrical stunt. And I think that was in part the point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a substantive question here, which is this has become a kind of MacGuffin, a sort of plot device for a certain part of the conspiratorial right, that there is some bombshell list of names that whoever they is, don't want you to know, that will expose the, pedo sex trafficking globalists or whatever your bad guy of choice is. It's not clear to me that anything like that exists, like that there's a thing being hidden that's not being released.
Chris, I've been on this story for over 7 years. I've interviewed, at this point, I think over 100 people who were involved in this investigation, who worked for Jeffrey Epstein, who were close to Jeffrey Epstein. And what I can tell you is that I think that this story in some ways has taken on a life of its own. This has been thoroughly litigated in courts, in civil litigation, in private settlement discussions. And yes, there is a huge volume of information that has not been released to the public. For example, the 302s of when the FBI interviewed victims. Those are generally not released to the public. And so there is information that is out there. But whether or not, as you say, it contains these bombshells, you have to remember that under many, many different presidencies, jurisdictions, we've had the Southern District of New York, who had multiple ongoing investigations, even after Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's trials, into alleged co-conspirators, into Prince Andrew, into other people that were around him. And those ultimately did not come to trial. So I think, yes, there is this view. And I think it's also really important, today. Why was it today? This information is in some cases decades old. DOJ has had access to this information for a very long time. And no one today that I talked to could give me a clear reason about why this happened today, with the exception of one very senior Department of Justice official who said that they perceived the purpose and the timing of this as a distraction from other matters. And I think that is a very, very telling statement.
Yeah. We don't know what those other matters are, though, do we?
We don't know precisely, but I think, as you've reported on your show, there are so many things happening across the Justice Department at every level that are extremely concerning to the staff there, as well as outside observers. And so I think this effort, is an indication of an effort to not have us answering those substantive questions.
I should note that one of the lawyers for one of the victims, Spencer Kuvin, says, I don't think there's anything new out there. This isn't a news story. It's a publicity stunt. He's worked on the case since 2005, representing 9 victims, including victim number 1. The only reason I can think of them to do this is to release certain names that will embarrass the Democrats. Kuvin said, of course, there were all kinds of names that are the same names that we've seen multiple times. Sarah Fitzpatrick, excellent reporting. Thank you so much for downloading that for us.
Always.
Let's bring in NBC's Julie Sirkin on Capitol Hill. Ashley Parker is a staff writer for The Atlantic and MSNBC political analyst. Doug Heye is a Republican strategist and former communications director for the RNC. Doug, I would say in an understatement, Susie Wiles has an unenviable job. When senators are hearing from unhappy constituents, they don't have any information to say, yes, but we've saved X amount of money, because some of the stuff that's been posted has turned out not to be true. How does Wiles convince them, or can she convince them, that they are not powerless in this? Or is the fact that they are?
Well, I think it comes mostly from Donald Trump. These senators need to hear directly from him so they can be bought into what he's doing. The challenge is, one, the uncertainty. People don't know what's being cut, and people are maybe losing their jobs or have gotten notice that they've been fired, but not actually fired. And then the firings themselves. There's a lot of changes in Washington that are going to happen over the next few years. But when you go back into states and congressional districts, things like cutting at the Veterans Affairs gets very unpopular very quickly. And I would tell folks in Washington, whether you're at think tanks or lobbying firms, if you know changes are going to happen, this is an opportunity for you to talk to clients about how to best protect what you're getting from the federal government, whether they're grants or appropriations or what have you, but also to propose your own. So, Arnold Ventures a couple weeks ago proposed, here are 10 ways we can cut. Here are 10 tax loopholes that we can close. It's a smarter way of doing things because we can't fix some of these things with a scalpel, and we shouldn't do it with a chainsaw. We need a good chef's knife right now in Washington, D.C.
But to his original point, Ashley, Senator Tillis says, it's problematic for cabinet secretaries to have someone pretending to be their boss. And at yesterday's cabinet meeting, they were put in the position of having to affirm that they approve of Elon Musk's work, although, they clapped for him. But what influence can Susie Wiles have if Musk is doing what Donald Trump wants him to do, and even has said he's doing a great job?
Well, first, that cabinet meeting you referenced, I think that moment was so telling because Elon Musk is saying, look, this isn't a performance review where we ask federal workers to send 5 bullet points. It's a pulse check, to make sure basically these people who say they're federal workers are showing up, can respond to an email, are not dead. But that's not what it is at all, because you had some of those members in the room who, when put on the spot, declined to stand up to Elon Musk, but who had very publicly told their employees, don't send this response. So you're getting incredibly conflicting messages of Elon saying, send this to prove you're alive in a sort of dismissive, snarky way, and then cabinet members and agency heads saying, don't send this. So it raises a lot of confusion for what is a federal employee to do. To answer your original question, what can Susie Wiles do? She is incredibly powerful. She's someone who understands the president, has a very strong relationship with him, has worked to have a relationship with Elon Musk. One of those things we know she said in that private meeting on the Hill before was, look, if there's a problem, you can come to me. But again, that's a sort of scalpel solution, right? As Doug was saying, that's having Doge come in, break everything into shards, and then Susie Wiles saying, look, if there's a shard that's really important to you, come back to me and I'll get you some super glue and we'll work on it. It may work in the margins, but you're right in that that's not sort of an actual fix across the federal bureaucracy for this very confusing, complicated dynamic that we're seeing unfold.
And one of the things that they've been sort of touting, the Elon Musk, the president, is they want accountability. They want to know that taxpayer dollars are being spent well. Well, accountability can work two ways, right? So let's say if the intention is to make sure that people who don't exist, who never existed, or who are dead are getting federal paychecks, have we seen accountability? Are there numbers? Do we know that there's a problem with people who don't exist getting federal paychecks?
Well, again, one of the challenges is that what Doge is saying, what Elon is saying, what President Trump is saying sounds incredibly appealing, right?
Yeah, commonsensical, right?
Cut the federal bureaucracy. There's too much bloat. There's waste. There's abuse. Just about everyone can potentially agree with that. The challenge, of course, is when you actually do it. There's no indication that they have sort of culled from these agencies, these alleged thousands of dead people who continue to cut a government paycheck. And when they say, for instance, they go after the low-hanging fruit and they fire probationary employees, that, again, common sense sounds like employees who are on probation, who have perhaps done something wrong. But when you report on it and peel back the curtain, most of the time, these quote unquote probationary employees may be people who have just gotten a promotion because they're such good employees, who have just moved their families to a different city or to a new agency because they were asked to do so, because their skill set was so valuable. So this is where we're seeing a talking point may poll well and sound good, but when the reality is someone who voted for Trump, works for the VA, suddenly gets laid off, which they find out when they can't log into their email and their paychecks stop coming, that's not particularly popular, even in a deep red district.
Yeah, Ashley, thank you for that. Okay, Julie, Republican senators met with Elon Musk today, and House Speaker Mike Johnson says he's trying to schedule a meeting where Musk can talk directly to House Republicans. Tell us more about all of that.
Well, just walking to get to this camera, I stopped a handful of senators from different states, North Dakota, Texas, Florida. All of them have heard from constituents, whether it's pertaining to cuts to the VA or other agencies, or concerned about this chainsaw approach that Musk is taking, particularly in the conversation and context of what we were talking about with these budget resolutions and the savings they need to come up with without getting into those entitlements. There are definitely concerns because constituents are calling them. I don't have to tell you about what we've seen with those House members last week and their town halls back home. But I thought it was interesting what Ashley was just saying, because we had this reporting, too, that Susie Wiles in that meeting with Republicans told senators, you can call me if you're hearing from folks and you have a problem with how these cuts are taking place. In the same vein, you heard from Rick Scott a couple of minutes ago, coming back from the White House and his meeting with Elon Musk, saying that Musk and his team gave them phone numbers of people that he's hired at Doge that they can contact if they have problems. So is it Wiles? Is it Musk? Who is running the show here? I think that is one of the problems that, of course, Republicans have here on Capitol Hill. All being said, though, senators who came back from that meeting today in the Doge caucus said it went amazing. They're thrilled with these cuts. On the other side here in the House, you have Speaker Johnson, who says he, too, wants to organize a similar meeting from members. Take a listen.
We're talking about a meeting, bringing Elon back over to meet with either small groups of members, appropriators, or maybe all the House Republicans. We're trying to figure out logistics, but he's anxious to share what he's finding, and a lot of the things he's told me in our private meetings, I said, we have to make sure all the members understand the degree of the fraud, waste, and abuse and how egregious it is.
Between November and Inauguration Day in January, Elon Musk was no stranger on Capitol Hill, right? He was holding meetings with Republicans in the Senate, in the House, talking through his plans. I think he might have gotten ahead of himself in terms of how much he is cutting and where, because as you heard from Tommy Tuberville, the senator from Alabama, he told me yesterday that he wants a scoreboard of where these cuts are coming from, no matter how conservative you are and how much you appreciate the effort to cut the deficit. Members of Congress want to be in control of this process because this is, in theory, something only they can control. They're just figuring out how to work hand in glove with Elon Musk to do it.
Yeah, complicated stuff, Doug, and far larger staff cuts are expected to be in the pipeline. I mean, the New York Times is reporting on a memo from the head of the White House Budget Office, which, quote, called for agencies to be drastically cut, in some instances, to the fullest extent allowed by the law. One line in the memo said agencies should focus on the maximum elimination of functions that are not statutorily mandated. Here's the problem, and it's a human nature it's NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. Yes, everyone can agree that there is waste. Everyone can agree there is bloat. But if it's my constituent, if it's in my backyard, well, that's where I draw the line. So how do you move forward with this in a way that actually does make sense and that the American people can understand?
Yeah, Chris, the first time I heard the term waste, fraud, and abuse was at a committee meeting, House Committee Communications Directors, when the House Budget Committee Communications Director talked about eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. It was a guy named Sean Spicer. I think we all know who he is. And the reality is we can and should eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. And we'll see Republicans hold up very specific examples of spending of $1 million here, $5 million there that sound and are outlandish and should be eliminated. The challenge is that doesn't get us there. And when you start cutting meat at the bones, to your point, this is where Republicans are going to hear from members of their constituency, whether in congressional districts or states. Governors are going to hear this as well, not necessarily in the uncertainty of these weeks where we are right now, but the slow burn if people lose their jobs and the funding that comes from that. 3 months, 6 months down the line. That's where, if I'm a Republican, electorally, I'm looking at what we see in the coming months, not necessarily in the next few days.
Yeah, and there's interesting reporting on how many Democratic governors and even Glenn Youngkin in Virginia are hiring some of these federal workers or making plans to hire them because they have institutional knowledge. They know how government works. We shall see. Julie Sirkin, Doug Heye, thank you both.